Hello students, today we will learn about the faults in rocks and the different parts of a fault, and will classify different types of fault. Now if we look at this figure, you can find that there is definite movement of this block, and this is along this plane. Means before this deformation, this layer and this layer were together, but after the deformation happens, they were departed from each other along this plane, and this is called faulting. Means displacement of two blocks along a plane or line. Now by definition of fault is, faults are the fissure or ruptures in the earth crust along which there is a definite displacement of the rock walls around the fault. And the most important phrase is the definite displacement, and that is the important thing which differs the faults from joints. Now where in joints there is no displacement, for the faults there is displacement. So this is the line along which these two things or the two blocks are displaced from each other. If you look at this figure, this is the fault plane, and along which the two sides of it were displaced from each other. So this is called fault, and the mechanism is called faulting. At the different parts of the fault, the first thing we need to know is the fault plane. Now this is the fault plane. This is exposed part, and there is a part of it which is covered by this part of this block. So a fault plane is the plane along which the two blocks were displaced from each other and which causes the faulting. So this is the fault plane. This is the fault plane, and the next thing that we need to know is the fault line. It is the surface trace of the fault, or rather the intersection of the fault plane and the horizontal surface. So this red line is the intersection of this horizontal surface or the earth surface and the fault plane, and this is called the fault line. Now if we look at this figure, there are two blocks in two sides of the fault plane, and one is called hanging wall and another one is called footwall. Now which one is hanging wall? Hanging wall is the part above the fault plane and footwall part is below it. But this is the definition, but the easy way to understand is the block on which we can stand on the fault plane is called the footwall, and where we cannot stand on the fault plane is called hanging wall. So here we can stand on the fault plane, but for this block we cannot stand on the fault plane. So this is footwall and this is hanging wall. Now hanging wall and footwall, these are only true if this is not vertical. If this is vertical, so we cannot say which is hanging wall and which is footwall. Rather we can say the left hand side of the fault and right hand side of the fault when the fault plane is vertical. Now the measurement of this movement is done using the term called slip. So what is slip or net slip? Slip or net slip is the amount of the relative movement of the two blocks in the fault plane. This is called net slip. But sometimes it is not possible to measure this slip or net slip because sometimes this is not present for us. This is eroded. So we can use the heave and the throw components, that are the horizontal and vertical component of the net slip, to find what is the amount of relative movement of the fault. So these are the different types parts of the fault: fault plane, fault line, hanging wall, footwall, slip, throw and heave. Now the classification of fault. Now the classification of the fault or the division of the faults is depend on the sense of slip or the relative movement of the blocks from each other. So it can be divided into two faults. One is strike slip fault and another one is deep slip fault. First, strike slip fault. If you remember, the strike definition, the definition of the strike line, this, that is the intersection of the plane and the surface. So this is the strike line of this fault plane or the fault. So you can see that the movement is lateral, that is along the strike line of the fault plane. So it is called strike slip fault. So strike slip fault is the fault where the movement of the two blocks are lateral or they move along the strike line of the fault, and you can see this is how it move along the strike line of the fault, and this is causing the strike slip fault. Strike slip faults again can be classified into two types depending on the relative movement of the two blocks along the strike slip fault. First is called the right lateral strike slip fault. Now it is the fault or the strike slip fault where the right hand's block is moving away from each other. That means if you stand here, the right hand side block is this and this is moving away from you, so it is called right lateral strike slip fault. And if you look at these two pictures, this is the right hand side and this is the right hand side, and this is the fault plane and this is the fault plane. So in both the cases the right hand side is moving away from you, so this is right lateral strike slip fault. And the next type of strike slip fault is called left lateral strike slip fault. So here the opposite, the left hand side block will move away from you. This is the left hand side block which is moving away from you, and these are the example where you can see the left hand side is moving away from you. So strike slip fault, the movement along the strike line of the fault plane can be divided into two parts: right lateral where the side block is moving away from you, and the left lateral where the left side block is moving away from you. The second type of fault is deep slip fault, and by the name you can find that means the movement of the fault is along the deep of the fault line. If you look at this figure, this is the deep of the fault plane, so the movement of this block is relative to this is along the deep of the fault plane. So this is called deep slip fault, where the movement is not lateral like the strike slip fault or not along this strike line, rather here the deep slip fault the movement is along the deep of the fault plane. And this is the classic example of the deep slip fault, where you can see the movement of the hanging wall is going down along the fault plane, deep of the fault plane. So this is called deep slip fault, and it is opposite to strike slip fault. Again, for deep slip fault, it can be divided into two groups depending on the movement of two blocks in case of deep slip fault. Now first is the normal fault. Normal fault is the fault where the hanging wall block has moved downwards relative to the footwall block. Now the reason it is called normal fault, because the hanging wall will, by the rule of gravity, should go down, and that is happening in case of normal fault, and that's why it is called normal fault. And it is caused by the extensional force or the tensional forces in the tensional regime, and these are the classic example of normal fault, where you can see this layer and this layer were together, but after the faulting it is departed from each other and the hanging wall block is going down respect to the footwall block, and which is normal due to the gravity action. Here is also the same, this part is going down, so this is called normal fault. Opposite to normal fault is called reverse fault. What is reverse fault? Reverse fault is the opposite of normal fault, where the hanging wall part is going up or moving upward relative to the footwall, and which is not normal in case of gravity action, and that's why it is called reverse fault. So the reverse fault is when the hanging wall block is moving upward relative to the footwall, and it is called by the compressional force, which is opposite to extensional force that happening in case of normal fault. And here you can see the hanging wall part is moving up while the footwall part is going down. So this is reverse fault. And if you look at these two pictures, you can see this is the hanging wall part and this is moving up. Here also the hanging wall part is moving up relative to the fault plane. This is the fault plane. So normal fault and reverse fault, two types of deep slip fault. There is another type of deep slip fault which is called thrust fault or the thrust. It is a type of reverse fault, but the difference of thrust fault or the thrust from reverse fault is only with the amount of deep angle of the fault plane. If it is less than 45 degree or it is relatively low angle to horizontal the fault plane, then it is called thrust or thrust fault. So thrust fault is a type of reverse fault only when the angle of deep of the fault plane is less than 45 degree, it is called thrust, and if it is above 45 degree it is called reverse fault. This is the classic example of thrust or the thrust fault, where you can see this is the reverse fault because this part, the hanging wall part, is going up or moving up relative to this, and the angle of this of the deep angle of this fault plane is also less than 45 degree. That means it is a reverse fault with less than 45 degree of fault plane, deep of the fault plane. So it is thrust fault or the thrust. So by the end of today's session, we were able to learn that what is a fault. That means it is a fissure or the rupture along which the two sides of it move away from each other. There is a definite displacement, and the footwall, the hanging wall, the fault line, fault plane, and the net slip of a fault. And we also learned about different types of faults like the strike slip fault, the deep slip fault, right lateral deep strike slip fault, left lateral strike slip fault. Then in the deep slip fault we had the normal fault, the reverse fault, and the thrust fault or the thrust. So this is the end of today's session about the faults in rock. Thanks a lot, and in second class or second session we will learn about the faults. Thank you.